Welcome to Secure by Design podcast from Secnora. I'm Daniel Kolig, your host, and this is the place where we talk about what is really important to build security into the way modern business run. Uh, so today is episode 6, and today we're diving into a topic that sits right at the intersection of security and leadership, uh, executive buy-in via tabletop exercises. Um, so if you work in security, pretty much the story. You talk about threats, vulnerabilities, frameworks, and then you pretty much hit the wall when it comes to real commitment from the executive team. So let's say, budgets stall, priorities shift, and, cyber still feels like an IT problem pretty much. So tabletop exercises changes that dynamic. When you put leaders into a realistic scenario, a breach, a ransomware lockdown, or, critical supplier going down, they see in real time what it means for operations, customers, and for the brand. That's the most important. Suddenly, cyber isn't abstract anymore. It's missed revenue, regulatory exposure, and tough calls that need to be made under pressure. So in this episode, we're going to talk about how to use tabletops as one of the most effective tools for earning executive buy-in, how to design them, who should be in the room, what typically goes wrong, and how to turn the lessons into real support for your security roadmap. Wow. So to explore this, I'm joined by Philip Lee, a cybersecurity practitioner who has spent a lot of time designing and running tabletop exercises with executive teams, helping them turn cyber risk from something theoretical into a concrete business conversations. So, Philip, welcome to the show. It's great to have you here.
Thank you. I'm looking forward to this. This is one of those topics that always gets me excited. It's one of the go-to ones that I like to write about and talk about. So I'm glad you guys have me here.
Great. So let's just start with my first question to you, Philip. Uh, so for those who don't know you yet, what's your path into cybersecurity, and how did you end up working so much with tabletop exercise and executive teams? If you could just share us a little background.
Yeah, so I started my career off doing IT operations activities and kind of in-house consulting, so special projects, and really fell in love with the consulting side of the technology world. And then about 5, 6 years ago, I got the opportunity to jump into cybersecurity. It was completely unexpected, but very much exciting. And within a short amount of time, I was working fractional CISO, vCISO style engagements. And so with those, right, when you're on those engagements, and eventually I got to leading those engagements, getting executive buy-in is kind of all or nothing, right? It matters from when you're working the deal cycle all the way throughout the year when you're working through security initiatives with executives. So the executive buy-in became very quickly a large chunk of my job. And so looking for ways to do that. Did all the standard thing, right? Board reporting, executive presentations, making sure they've got the right metrics and data, but looking for ways to do that more effectively, faster, and in a way that actually appeals to executive was still needed. And as I start to do tabletops and experiment with different tabletop styles and compare styles with others, really executive focused tabletops start to emerge as one of the quickest and most effective ways to get executives bought in, get budgets approved if needed, but also showcase specific scenarios that executives might want to be worried about. This tabletop kind of came to the forefront. What I'll say is that while I use tabletops very often with executives, I try to avoid kind of fear-based tabletops, right? The goal is not to scare them. If I run a tabletop where the executive team has been frightened into acting, that might be effective, but it means pretty much every conversation going forward is going to be, well, how bad is this? What should I be worried about? And there's an element of that. There's a large element of that. but it leads to a very pain-oriented conversation every time. And when you're trying to build proactive programs, if you've always got the worst case scenario and the fear-based messaging, tabletops can kind of complicate it. So running these tabletops effectively has become kind of key.
Okay, so what a journey! What a journey, Philip. So
Thank you.
it's clear you have had one foot in the technical world and one in the business world. At the same time for a long time, which is exactly where tabletops live. All right,
Yeah.
so yeah, pretty much. So uh, let's just continue that path. When we talk about executive buy-in via tabletops, what does that actually mean in practice? What's different? Compared to a traditional cyber awareness session
Mhm.
or a slide deck briefing, for example.
Yeah, so for me, it goes beyond just that they understand what cybersecurity is. They understand threats and vulnerabilities and all that. You can achieve that through various means. And like you mentioned, training and specific training sessions for executives can be done. But buy-in through a tabletop really looks like executive engagement. And it looks like the executives
Hmm.
playing an actual role, just like they would in a real world scenario, and role playing how they would respond, how they would handle different scenarios, and getting them to think about things like they would in a real world scenario, not an academic setting, not a financial, hey, this risk could cost us $500,000 if it comes to fruition, but very much like, let's walk through what happens if this risk comes to fruition, leads to actual engagement. And that engagement can translate into buy-in. It can translate into budget requests approved. I've come out of tabletops where the CFO's going, how much would it cost to close this gap? And the CISO goes, well, there's this tool that I think would get us really close once my team can deploy it and run it and implement it. Like, great, I can sign off on that number right now, all the way to I want a follow-up workshop. Like, I want us to walk through kind of how we've designed our program to improve resiliency here, or what else is needed. And so that's what buy-in to me looks like. It looks like engagement that outlives the tabletop. Because you can run a really fun tabletop that only lasts for that hour and a half, 2 hours, 3 hours, and then the executives go home, feel really good. Yes, we did a good job. We have all the answers. And then they think about it never. Like, they don't come back to this until the next tabletop. And so the goal really is to make this an opportunity to fold them into the conversations and get them thinking proactively.
Yes. So what I'm really hearing here is that this really shift cyber from a how should I put this, like a presentation about risk to a shared a set of experiences of the risk, and that's where the behavior really starts to change, right?
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
yeah, okay, so
Yeah. So
that is
the point you made about risk, I love risks, and I love using risks as a vehicle for communicating things to executives. And they have their place, but the tabletops can drive movement and continuous momentum. And so that's kind of what I like about them.
exactly. All right, so before the executive experience their first tabletop, what are the most common misconceptions they have about cybersecurity or incident response?
Yeah, I think the first big one, and this one I think is obvious to a lot of practitioners, is
Uh-huh.
a lot of folks, including practitioners, think about cybersecurity tabletops, incident response tabletops as a deeply technical exercise. And they can be, right? They can be deeply technical. They can be hands-on keyboards with your technical teams. But in the context of an executive tabletop, the goal is to elevate the questions that matter to those executives into that conversation, right? I'm going to run an executive tabletop and a technical tabletop differently. One of the things I like to do even is to run a technical tabletop first. Note all the questions that came out, like, well, we're going to need the CEO to make this decision, or we need to fold in legal, and kind of note on the timeline, where did we have escalation questions? And then
Mhm.
translate that into a condensed tabletop for leadership. As your technical team is doing these 10 things, this is one of the first questions they need a decision on. Here are kind of the different outcomes, and walk them through those. And that can also help clear up this misconception because, hey, there is a technical tabletop, but there's also a non-technical one. But this one's a big one. This one's recurring. I get people that actually ask me, hey, can you run a technical tabletop for executive team? And when I look at their executive team, the only folks that have a technical background are maybe the CTO and the CIO in that conversation. And it's like, well, look, I can if you really want me to. but how about we find the middle ground that hits a very technical risk or vulnerability that we're trying to show an exploitation of, but let's present it in a way that isn't a deep dive into jargon and tools. So that's the first really big one. It continues to come up. The other big one is this is changing, and I've noticed it's changed over the last couple of years, but it's still there. A lot of executives think they come to even an executive tabletop to watch. They're there to watch a show put on by their security team or their security and infrastructure and IT teams, right? They're looking to see a performance.
Mhm.
And that can be helpful, right? As a CISO, you may want to show off all the hard work your team has done, and I completely understand that. But if you're driving a tabletop you want executives to be engaged and bought in on, they need to come ready to play the game. And
Yeah.
so kind of framing it in the right way with them helps avoid this misconception, but this is a big one. And then the other big one I see is we have to have everybody in the room. And this one's one that's near and dear to my heart because, frankly, I prefer more intimate tabletops. If I can do a tabletop with less than a dozen people in the room, the better. But I run tabletops with 40 people in the room. They're challenging, they're difficult. You have people who are there that their boss invited them to listen in, they didn't get that memo. And
Mhm.
so the executives at times can come with this expectation because it wasn't framed in a way that clicked, that they're there to watch the security team go through a dog and pony show. So they're coming while working on something else, or they're coming very much unprepared because they weren't prepared. And that really falls on the practitioners organizing the tabletop, but it is a one that used to be quite common and is still around some now.
Yeah, so it seems like, it's also a human factor, like just we are all humans and as you said, the more intimate, less people in the room, the more likely you are to open up and
Yeah.
pretty much get, better inputs and the better results as a
Yeah. And I
mm,
think you're spot on. People open up. The human factor plays a big role. I've
mhm.
been in tabletops where, in a smaller setting, people are more willing to throw themselves in the bus. Like, yes, I would have made this mistake if it's something like we're showcasing, like, look, IT accidentally gave somebody misconfigured credentials or things like that. In a smaller setting, people are more willing to be open and honest, especially if they're seeing the executives being open and honest. But if you've got a 40-person tabletop, your IT admin may not be willing to throw themselves under the bus to emphasize the scenario component. Your director of infrastructure may be unwilling to share that your infrastructure isn't as resilient for the scenario as they would like because there's stakeholders they don't know about. There's agendas, there's politics, there's all these different factors.
Of
And the
course.
human element starts to really come into play beyond a certain size. And so
Yeah.
that is something to plan for, is to ask your clients and ask your teams what politics they have to be aware of. It's not quite a misconception, but it plays that human element you mentioned. Like, what are the politics here? Is there an
Big
executive
time.
that you're scared of looking bad in front of, right? Is there an executive who really wants to cut your budget? And so if you look bad, this is a problem. It doesn't necessarily mean we change the scenario, but it is an important consideration for how do you frame things? How do you communicate? How do you make sure people aren't set up to fail?
Yep. So I'm very happy here that we kind of agree on the same yeah, we're around the spots here. So okay, now let's change gears a little bit. Just want to learn like from your experience, what makes a tabletop exercise really land with executives? How do you design it so that leaders see the business impact, not
Yeah.
just a stream of bunch of technical details?
Yeah, so I'll start this one with an anecdote.
Okay.
Early in my cyber career, I was running one of the very first tabletops I was running solo or as the lead. We had worked with a very siloed security team to build a scenario, to develop a scenario custom to them. They had somewhat ignored our recommendations for what scenario to do, how to approach it, but it was an executive tabletop. They're very siloed. We could not get them to bring other executives into the fold ahead of the tabletop. So we kind of went in slightly apprehensive, but it was jarring when about 30, 40 minutes into the tabletop, one of the executives in the call who oversaw pretty much software engineering, this was a SaaS company, so you can imagine he had a very vital role, in front of all these other executives and in front of the team that was there to do a lot of heavy lifting, went, we're stopping this tabletop right now. I want a phone call with all of you. So the core team jumps on a call with him, and he is upset. He's frustrated because the scenario doesn't reflect something that he thinks is important. It doesn't reflect what he thinks the company should be focusing on from a security perspective. And once we got through kind of the frustration and difficulty, it boiled down to a couple of key concepts that I think answer this question. But the first one was scenario design. If
Mhm.
your scenario does not land with your executives, if it is not a scenario tailored to the things they are concerned about, it doesn't matter how good of a scenario it is. It doesn't matter how well your team does. That stickiness factor, that engagement factor is going to be hampered. It may not be completely gone, but you're going to have a harder time of it. It doesn't mean you can't educate executives ahead of time that, hey, we're not doing a ransomware attack because this is a lot less impactful to us, right? Supply chain threats might be a much bigger issue to us, but you need to be able to design a right size scenario that is tailored to your audience. And if you have to do a little bit of education ahead of that, do so. I ran a tabletop recently with an executive team very unaware of their threat landscape, not by their own fault. So the first hour was the team going over their threat landscape and kind of educating them on like, hey, here's a common threat types in your industry. Here are the threat groups that target you guys. Are you guys seeing nation state actors versus financially motivated attackers? And so once we did some of that world building, right, if you go back to kind of classic D&D or to other role-playing games, once we'd established the universe that they operate in from a threat landscape perspective, then it gave us the right runway to showcase a scenario that I don't think they would have thought of, that wasn't a classic ransomware scenario, but a very tailored scenario to them based on risks from their risk register that landed. And so I think scenario design is first and foremost. And how you do that with the world building can make all the difference.
Yep.
The second is really understanding the motivations of the executive team. Understanding, are they being voluntold into showing up? Has the CISO pretty much called on every favor he asked to get these executives into the room? Changes how you approach the tabletop. Again, right? You may have to do more legwork up ahead of time. You may have to frame the questions differently. You may have to give them more pieces of the puzzle early in the game to walk through that exercise. But what you want to do is make sure that you account for the personalities in the room and the motivations. And if everybody's really excited and you've been talking to executives here and there over the last couple of months, and they're all very excited about this, that's fantastic. I mean, you're set up for success out the gate. If not, you may want to spend some time meeting with them ahead of time. And when you're building your scenario, meeting with some of the stakeholders and asking them, hey, what are you worried about? What objectives would you have for this tabletop? If I'm going to ask for 2-3 hours of your time, what do you want to get out of it? What would you like to happen? I might not be able to make all of those wishes come through if I've got 4 or 5 executives I'm having this conversation with, but I can look for the common ones across those. I can look for some of the themes, and then I can highlight those as we go through the scenario, right? You can pull in aside and say, hey, look, I understand that we're very, very concerned about supplier threats. So when we talk through this, let's look at the ripple effects in our supply chain. Let's look at what other opportunities there are. And so that kind of those core ones that I focus on a lot. And to your earlier comment, a lot more revolve around people. What are their
Mhm.
motivations? What value do they need to get out of it? What do they hope to get out of it? Are there any specific scenarios that keep them awake, right? I have a lot of CEOs who go, I get news alerts on security things, and they're kind of like summarized news articles. I'm really concerned about this threat vector. And sometimes you go, great, we can do something with that. Others, you have to go, that's great, but does it really apply to your company, your industry in the same way, right? You don't need to be as worried about this. Maybe we focus on this, which you should be worried about.
Yeah, I really like the way you framed that. And you know what I took from what you just said is one thing that I think you mentioned about education, about educating the executives about, then you said about motivation, but I would say the question would be, you know first you need to be motivated in order to actually be willing to learn something. So
Yep.
if you're not motivated, then you just be not willing to acquire new knowledge. So I think these are the fundamentals.
Yep.
That's what I kind of
And
think.
you occasionally run into this where you have an executive who's not motivated, who no matter what levers you pull, no matter how exciting you make it, no matter how many of their feedback
Yeah.
points, it's so far removed from their day-to-day job, or they've got so many other fires and activities going on that it is going to be hard to get them motivated. And if that's the case, you may have to accept that and focus on the majority instead of the one. And that is a risk that can happen, right? If I can fail at tabletop if I focus on just the person I know is going to be difficult because they don't want to be here or whatever their reason may be. If I focus my tabletop on making them happy, they may walk away content. And everybody else is like, well, was I needed? Like I didn't get what I wanted. So
again, human factor again. I don't know,
yeah,
but it comes up a lot as a common factor here. All right,
yeah.
so so moving along. So if you break down a really effective tabletop for executives, what are the key ingredients? What has to be there for it to be worth their time? What's the secret sauce then? If there is any.
Yeah, so when we talk anatomy, I mean, the first thing that comes to mind is the skeleton, right? It doesn't matter
Okay.
what you do, if that skeleton is not stable and able to carry the weight of the muscle and everything else, then it's not going to work. So what I consider kind of the skeleton of a good tabletop is the kill chain. When I develop a tabletop with clients, I build actual kill chains that are tailored to them, that are very
Mm-hmm.
realistic, as in they could be executed in the right set of circumstances today against this company, or they represent a combination of risk factors coming to life from their risk assessments and some of the activities they've done. And so if I have a very good kill chain with defined steps, with defined injects, with the right data, right? Because there's places you want to present data, that
Mm-hmm.
goes a long way anatomy wise, because it means no matter what goes wrong, I can always fall back to the basic structure, which is the kill chain. And it allows me as a facilitator to pivot and adjust as we find new data points or new systems come into play. As long as that skeleton is realistic and stable, I can have a lot to work with. And it gives the client a lot to work with. Right, because it's
Mm-hmm.
just keeping up with this analogy. I can add a lot of different body types onto the skeleton. I can modify things. But if I don't have a good skeleton, it's going to make my life a lot harder. So I consider kill chain kind of vital to that. Other things that I really like, the really nice to haves that go a long way, especially in executive tabletops, is a right sized visual element, right? I don't like tabletops where it's just a bunch of text on a screen, or on the flip side, it's just a picture and that we all stare at this picture for 15 minutes and then we move on to the next picture. Those don't capture the imagination. They don't. We've talked a little bit about the skeleton, but I think one thing that is great is if you're running a tabletop, regardless of the format, it needs to come alive. So if you do a text heavy tabletop, that's going to lose the attention span. That's going to be heavy. If you do just pictures, the inverse happens. People are going to be staring at each picture for 15 minutes and they're going, okay, I don't understand. So I like to do some text on my tables tops, maybe some icons, maybe some flowcharts. But the biggest thing is make it feel alive. And that can look like a lot of different things. But one of the things I've done is emulate, if we're doing like an adversary that is communicating with you, have some examples of that
Mm-hmm.
communication. I ran a tabletop recently where we heavily modeled it based off of the Cura Group's methods. So we used some of their communication examples that they've published online that have been leaked in the actual scenario design. So when executives were like, well, we made decision X, I have a couple of pre-written emails or things like that that I can present to the executive team like, okay, you made X decision. Here's kind of the response from the attackers. And that gives me kind of like a decision tree option, one. Um, it, Ideally, they don't prevent me from moving along with the scenario, but they give me a decision tree. They give the clients an option to pick between different views. But the other thing is they're fun to look at. They're fun to read. Occasionally you'll get an example where they're like, why does this read strange? Or I've had ones where they go, man, the English in this is perfect. And they're forced to kind of confront some of the stereotypes they have about some of the attacker groups. Other times they'll be like, wait, why does this look like a chat function and like a support tool? I was like, well, attacker groups you're up against, many times they offer customer support where you can chat with one of their agents and it leads to some helpful conversations about it being a business.
Right.
Those beat hands down me just putting it on a slide in text or a visual and just trying to verbally explain it. If I can add something to it, fantastic. I have a buddy who does tabletops for a living. He recently did a tabletop, I want to say with a law firm, and
Uh-huh.
they still use a lot of facts for communication. So the scenario actually started with all the executives in a room kind of doing the introductions and stuff when one of the secretaries brought in a fax document that says who was not in on the scenario, but she goes, it's addressed to the lead partner. And she goes, I think you need to read this. We got a fax message that reads like a threat. And sure enough, it was the beginning of the cyber incident. But for the rest of the tabletop, that paper is in the middle. And so when they wanted to consult with hey, what was in there, things like that, somebody can grab that and actually pick up that piece of paper and go like, well, they say they want X amount, or they want it in Bitcoin or Ethereum. And it serves as kind of a tangible medium to make the scenario come alive. Not to mention the unfortunately mildly panicked secretary who got to deliver this note. But it
Exactly.
does add to the realism. Those kind of things add to realism, but they also help, again, build that engagement. Because if an executive goes, wait, my ransomware gang has a support portal that I can go ask questions of, and I can text with them in English or Mandarin or a variety of languages. Well, yeah, you can ask them for support. And you see
Hmm.
groups actually that get upset if you don't respond within a certain amount of time. So the the visuals, the graphics, the data you provide a customer is helpful. The other thing I've done, and this is kind of depending on the client, depending on their proficiency level, but also kind of knowing their culture, I occasionally have asides. And so what this means, like, it's a pull aside in the tabletop where like, hey, I've got a slide or a document. It's like, hey, we're going to pause for a second and we're going to walk through why this is important, right? Back to your point about education kind of being critical here is like, look, if we know this is going to be a challenge for people to understand, we might dedicate some time to talk through the mechanics of it and do it just like a CISO might do in a real world scenario. Like, hey, look, I know we're all very focused on responding, but I need you guys to kind of understand how this happens, what technology is impacted, what the things look like. And so it doesn't work for every tabletop, and it can kind of pull you out of the moment, right? It's like breaking the fourth wall in a movie. But if done right, it is a great vehicle to round out that experience. And Gen AI was first coming to the forefront, did some tabletops around LLMs and phishing and voice phishing and video phishing. And we had to do that quite a bit in those tabletops. So it's like, hey, let's walk through how easy it is now to do voice phishing attacks and show executives an example like, hey, your CTO regularly does interviews in nice studios with perfect audio, perfect video, and he's talked about his family. He's talked about things he likes to do in these, all very natural things, kind of like you and I are doing now, but in the right context. An attacker has all these data points that make it seem real if they do a phishing attack on their team. And
Yeah.
so those little pull asides may seem jarring, but they can do wonders for actually deepening the buy-in in the scenario and using it as an educational vehicle. So those are
Oh,
all kind of critical. But last but not least, I think flexibility is key, right? In the context of a tabletop,
okay.
structure your workflows in a way that, hey, if you hit a wall and you're all stuck on an inject, structure in a way that you can move on and go to the next thing or do something to have that suspension of disbelief that sometimes is needed in a tabletop. So I think if you do those things, you have the anatomy of a really good tabletop. But the last thing I want to highlight here is lessons learned. It can be easy to get to end of a tabletop, especially some of the longer ones, and be ready and tell people, yeah, we'll do very quick lessons learned. And then you guys have any thoughts, email it to us, which really puts the burden on the team facilitating the tabletop and the security team who may be present to put together their notes, but you end up with a
Mhm.
very security practitioner focused set of lessons learned. And if you can have a really good lessons learned conversation, and ideally at least 30 minutes, depending on kind of the length of the tabletop, you can make some real headway to understand, okay, you and I as security practitioners, we were worried about X, but the CEO and CFO are very concerned about communications to customers in an incident and that we didn't have the communication team in here. And the general counsel isn't comfortable with communications going out in press releases without the general counsel reviewing, right? That is a great lesson learned. That is a great process oriented lesson learned. But if it's just a bunch of security folks in a room, we may be focused on the technical things. We may be focused on the process improvements on the response side, whereas the executives may have a completely different set of takeaways. And so focusing on those lessons learned is kind of critical to rounding out the tabletop.
I
Otherwise, you
mean,
do risk losing that magic.
mhm. Okay. So what I heard and what we heard today from this little talk is, first of all, I mean, to my understanding, like, the tabletop is pretty much, the skeleton that you said, so I would envision like a structure, meaning, the right scenario, the right people, the clean data, the
Yeah.
flexibility plus the lesson learned, and then you're all powered, armed and dangerous, so to speak, to expose the real gaps.
Yeah.
That's yeah. So yeah, I think this makes a total sense. Okay, so when the goal is to buy in, who absolutely needs to be in the room? Like, there's like, what's the absolute minimum? Is this a, it needs to be a board level exercise, an ELT exercise, maybe a combination mix of business, maybe technical leaders. Who do you think should be? Who's necessary there
Yeah.
to
So
be
I
in there?
think this goes back to the fundamentals of the tabletop. And that
Okay.
involves, what are your objectives, right? We didn't talk about this a whole lot today, but when you're scheduling a tabletop and determining that you want to do a tabletop, you're probably going to, or should be at least, developing a set of objectives. What are the things you want to get out of it? What are the things you want to happen in it? Those objectives really do drive who's in the room, right? So if
Mhm.
the objective at its core, the biggest objective of all of them is ELT education, then yeah, you need your entire ELT in there. And that impacts scenario design and all those other things we've talked about. If you say, hey, our objective is to enhance collaboration with the non-technical leaders that are involved in the IR or business continuity process, then that changes it, because then I might have core executive team, right? Might have my CEO, my CFO, COO, CTO, depending on the structure of the company. I might have some of those non-technical leaders,
Mhm.
but I may also want director level and manager level representatives of technology teams, both on the security side, and on IT and on infrastructure, because I am trying to use that tabletop to build cohesion, to build communication, to allow those teams to kind of bridge some of those relationships gaps that may be there. And so when I look at all of those, it can really vary. What I'll say is, think hard about your objectives, and that should drive who's in the room. I don't have a set list of people I say have to be in the room, except for whoever wears your security hat. And in some organization, that's your IT admin who's stuck wearing a security hat. It could be a manager of security. It could be a CISO. It could be a director. But regardless, if you have one of those at a client and they're not in the room, you probably have a problem. So I that one's obvious, but I've seen executive tabletops where there may be a CTO, and down on the org chart, security rolls up to him as like a manager of security and IT, like 3 or 4 levels below. And they go, well, we won't need them. I'll talk to security. But they're not in the weeds. They don't have always have a good pulse on the tech stack from the security perspective and all those things. They don't have a good time estimate. Like, how much time would it take that IT and security manager to execute some of these processes that they make decisions on? And so it may seem obvious to have security folks there, but sometimes you do have leadership. And this is executives only, right? We only want director level above. And it's like, well, your security person is a manager, and they're very, very good. You want them in this room. You can't run it without them. But other than that, I don't have a set list. What I would say is, I really do like having general counsel in the room for pretty much any kind of tabletop. General counsel, whether they're treated as an executive or not in the company, can be a game changer. They're thinking about these same problems very differently. They're thinking about it from a liability and a criminal perspective. So they're always nice to have, in my opinion. And I try to make it a point to invite them, or to get the client to invite them. But what I'd also say is, don't force people to be in the room, right? If you're running a tabletop scenario and you say, hey, we really want every member of the ELT in the room, like all the C-suite, maybe a couple of SVPs, and one of your SVPs and your CEO is like, it can't happen, won't provide availability, things like that. It's like, it's better to have a good tabletop with a smaller group of people that isn't reflective of your entire target audience, that moves the needle, than try and kind of round whole square peg it, right? It's just not going to work as well. And so,
Mhm.
yes, you should put the time and effort in to get all the people you think need to be there. But if you're running into roadblocks, it may be worth doing it with, hey, look, the CEO could not make it, and that's okay. Or the SVP of operations couldn't be here today. That's okay. Because eventually, if you do your tabletop right, and everybody's thinking about it, and there's executive buy-in, the executives in that room are going to talk about it amongst themselves. They're going to talk about it in meetings. They're going to talk about it at board level events. And that might prompt the CEO to go, wait, I want another tabletop, and I want to be on this one, because it sounds like it wasn't just a compliance check the box exercise. And that's often a fear. So
Mhm.
take what you can get within reason, right? If you only have 2 executives out of a team of 8 that are willing to show up, you need to go back to drawing board. But
Yeah.
don't be so caught up on who has to be in the room that you ruin the experience for everybody else.
Okay, so I mean, I really agree. It's a great point, Philip. But I must say, based on what I heard here from you, that so to speak, the attendee list. I mean, come on, it tells you a lot about how seriously the organization takes the cybersecurity. Period. I mean,
Oh yeah.
you know,
If I'm looking for the outside in and I get a report about a tabletop and I look at the attendee list and it's called an executive tabletop and there's not a single executive there or only a handful of executives, again, to your point, that tells me the buy-in might not be there. But it
exactly.
also tells me the organization may be thinking of the executive tabletop wrong, right? It may be misframing it as a high-level technical tabletop and they're calling it an executive tabletop, right? There's a lot of things to look for when you see that. But yes, I think if you're calling it an executive tabletop, so the attendees have to skew executive. Regardless of your title structure, the roles have to be reflective of that.
Yeah, I'm not, that takes us to the next question on that, part. So on a practical level, how do you get those busy executives to actually commit time to a tabletop if they actually, thinking about, joining the pool of brainstorming people. So what framing have you seen work best when you're, selling the idea inside the team, for example?
I think one of the key framing points is you have to convey yourself and through your champions in the organizations, your CISOs, your directors, the folks that are championing this meeting, you have to convey it's an actual executive tabletop. It is
Mm.
not a technical tabletop or it has a smaller technical component than most, but you have to convince the executives that, hey, this is actually for you. We're going to talk about things that matter to you. We're going to talk about how do we handle insurance? How do we handle customer response? How do we handle the cost structures associated with recovery? Those are the basics, but they also cover a lot of the motivations that the different executives have, right? The CFO's going to be heavily focused on the financial side and on speed to get back up and running, as the COOs and CTOs tend to be focused on a similar thing. But your general counsel is really focused on minimizing liability in these situations, minimizing kind of how much money you can get in your insurance payout and making sure that you're not violating any laws in the process. You need to communicate to those executive stakeholders, yourself and the champions in the org, that it's going to be a tabletop for them. If you start talking
Mhm.
about, hey, we're going to get into the details and you're going to watch the technical folks pull up tools and really show you what they've got, executives aren't going to resonate with that unless they've got a deep technical fascination, but they're not going to want to show up to a technical tabletop. So I think framing it the right way, kind of how you put it, a lot of that comes down to this is an actual executive tabletop, and give my examples of the kind of subjects you're hoping to hit. Similarly,
Yeah.
I think two timing related items. Executive tabletops can't be as long as a technical tabletop. I think
Okay.
some folks are very prone to the longer the tabletop, the better. That isn't always the case. And you're going to have a hard time getting executives to show up for 3 hours than you are for an hour and a half. And
Sure.
so think very clearly about kind of what your executive schedules are. Ask their executive assistants and their teams, like, hey, how busy are they any given week?
Yeah.
And look at it realistically. If they never have, like, even 2 months out in advance, and anything longer than an hour and a half slot on their schedule, that is your limiting bracket. And that anything above that means they're not going to show up, or they're going to show up for the first hour and a half and then drop right when they're really needed. Um, so that's the first timing thing. Is actually really putting some thought into how long does this have to be
Mhm.
effective, but not so long that executives are just going to dismiss it out of hand as a massive time expenditure they can't afford. The other timing related item is there's a sweet spot for how far out to put this meeting invite on their calendar. If you put it too far out in advance of the calendar, their teams, their assistant, whoever's involved in booking time with them, are not going to be tracking this 3 hour block, let's say, on their calendar 6 months out. And so they may commit to vacation plans, they may commit to all these things that are natural, but that mean they're not going to be there day of. So
No, of course.
I have found between 2 to 3 months out, in my experience, especially with SaaS companies, tends to be the sweet spot. It's far enough
Okay.
out that you can find availability and kind of see vacation schedules and things like that, but not so far out they're going to go, yeah, I can do that, and then forget about it. In that sweet spot, 2 to 3 months ahead, they tend to be, it's on their mind, where their executive assistant's going, no, can't do December the 15th because that afternoon we've got a tabletop. So no, we can't go be a keynote at this conference, or we can't take this end of the year strategy session during that window. So
Mhm.
there is a sweet spot. It's going to vary for every org, but that timing piece is, again, key to getting executives to show up, because they may be all gung-ho to show up. They may be all excited to show up. But if we're not actually factoring in how their schedules work and move and how much true availability they have, you're going to set yourself up for failure, because everybody wants to be there. But you ask for 4 hours in 1 month, and they'll go, yeah, we'll make it work. And you show up, and there's a third of people you hope to be there.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, I like that positioning and those different examples. Pretty much, it's probably, you know, it probably works differently for everyone. Like these worked well for you, and I mean, the scheduling makes sense. The agenda planning, of course. But I'm also thinking, like, what if, for example, like, how you even call, the agenda itself. Like, for example, if you could, like, not just put it into the security bucket, just put it for example in and call it like a, I don't know, resilience or business continuity session.
Yeah,
It mentally changes the game. I mean,
you're
that's
you're
what I would say.
100% on. It's I've been using the word exercise a lot, and there's other phrases used like workshop and things like that. Some of those words have a lot more meaning than you and I might give them credence innately. Some of them might sound like, oh, it's an audit activity, or oh, it's pass or fail. And tabletops,
Mhm.
truly, if you're in it to learn, no matter how badly it goes, they don't have to be pass or fail. And so I think you're spot on. Framing, even in the meeting invite, matters. And to your kind of continuing your point, one thing I found helps is not just advocating for it in your quarterly or monthly security roundup for those executives, like your 30, 45-minute meeting where you're going over the security things. Yeah, make sure they know what's happening there. Make sure you reinforce the value there. But see if it can get brought up at the ELT session a couple of months in advance. Like, right, take every opportunity to right-sized advocate for it and give executives a chance on their own turf, so to speak, right, on their own field to go, wait, do I really need to be there? It sounds like it's going to be deeply technical, or it sounds like I'm not needed because one of my team members can go in my stead. And that gives you a chance to go, well, Daniel, I think the team member you talk about could be immensely valuable, but realistically, there are decisions that they're going to say, well, Daniel would have to decide. And so we'd like you in the room so you can actually show us how you're thinking about these challenges. So as we build out our resiliency plans, we factor those in. And you'll notice I didn't use the word security or compliance in that explanation, but to your point, use phrasing like, hey, these are things that matter to you. You want your opinion heard. You want the processes reflective of kind of your vision. And so I do think, to your point, how you approach that from that side can also be really kind of crucial.
That's right, indeed. Okay, so in the tabletops you have run, what kinds of decision-making gaps typically surface, and how do you highlight them without making leaders, defensive? That's kind of the safe description of that.
So we talked about this briefly earlier, but the lessons learned
Yeah.
and making sure that they're involved in the lessons learned is critical. This is one of those key reasons why. If the tabletop is exposing decision-making gaps, if I, as a consultant or third party, am highlighting them, I can push a sore spot, or I can highlight a politics issue in the company I'm not aware of. However, if it's somebody in that leadership team, if it's somebody in that executive tabletop, bring it to the forefront, who's not on the security side, who's not, we're going like, look, I identified that I don't have a right channel with legal and with the comms team to get these communications reviewed and out in a timely manner. That changes things, because often you'll see a good leader will frame it as like, I need to work on X. I need to ask my team to build X, Y, and Z with this other team. And them highlighting it means they're framing it without blame, or are taking the blame themselves more likely. You occasionally run into teams where the executives want to throw each other in the bus, and they're like, yeah, well, it really sounds like the IT department just refuses to talk to operations and just doesn't want to play ball. And that might come from an operational leader. And it may be true, but that gives me the chance, like, they said it. I can kind of step in as a facilitator and mediator and reframe it, reposition it, or give an example of a solution that should make both teams happy. If I've got one off the top of my head, as an example, right? You don't want to lock yourself into solution necessarily in the conversation, but it gives you some independence from the blame game to step in and be that mediator. So regardless of whether in-house or external, like I often am, try and maintain that impartiality at the end. Let them bring it to the forefront, because either you can kind of continue to move something along that they have highlighted they want to work on, or two, you have some impartiality to serve as that mediator to reframe maybe a challenging position where somebody's pointing the finger.
Mhm.
But common decision-making gaps I see are, like I said, I like general counsels and tabletops and IR processes. They're often forgotten, which means you might get to the finish line and we forgot to notify insurance, which means we don't meet the criteria for getting insurance payout because we didn't report within the necessary time, or
Mhm.
the approach we take may violate industry specific laws and regulations to us as a part of a recovery process. So failing to loop in legal until the finish line is a common one I see in tabletops, especially with less mature organizations. Um, the other one is kind of the opposite of the blame game, which is I don't want to make this decision. And people
Oh.
just keep punting it further up the ladder. And I did a tabletop with a very well respected CISO in a very large organization last year. Great guy, really like him and his team, and they do fantastically. However, because of the size of the organization and because the impact the decisions he would make in an IR scenario, he didn't feel comfortable making some decisions that I would ordinarily see a CISO being the first line decision maker. And they kept going, well, I'd need the CEO to chime in on this, or the board. And that became a theme throughout this tabletop, which was I need to move it one or two levels above me for decision making. And I've seen that with other non-security executives in tabletops too, where the team's going, well, we need a CEO to make this decision, or we need the board to make this decision. And it's like, okay, maybe you do. But also we've got 80% of senior management here, and we've met a quorum for voting for things that aren't board level votes. Can we really not reach a consensus here? And so then it becomes kind of the facilitator's role to highlight, look, we punted a third of the decisions to the CEO or to the board, and like snap decisions, right? Things we need to move very quickly on. And that's when you can go like, is this feasible? Is this realistic? Do we need to go ahead and get them to give us their opinions ahead of time on how they would like us to make those decisions? Because then, maybe we sit down with the CEO and the 20 questions that came up, or the board, and be, okay, tell us what you would like us to do with these hypotheticals. And we'll bake that into our scenario playbooks as kind of the directed path. Obviously, that might change in the real world, but at least we've got it on paper, and we've kind of prompted some conversation to go like, look, your team really wants to make decisions. And occasionally a CEO or a senior executive will go, I don't want to make this decision. I trust my CISO. I trust my CTO to make this decision for us. Great. That is something we can play back to that stakeholder and we're like, look, your CEO wants you to feel empowered. And again, that assuages a lot of blame, but it also hits a common gap, which is nobody wants to be left holding the hot potato. So it gets passed along so long or so high that you make decision-making processes sometimes longer than they need to be. And this isn't to say
Yeah.
there aren't decisions that need executives to, like CEOs and boards, to make the final call.
Yeah, exactly. And I think you hit the point, like, lack of decision, making process, or, you know, pretty much it hurts, the whole chain of it's like a chain reaction, like no
Yeah.
decision is it's bad, it delays everything. So, spot on, and
And in a
also
tabletop, yeah, sorry. In a tabletop, you want people to make a decision that might be bad. I'd rather have a bad
exactly,
decision that we can talk about and assess than no decision. And so sometimes it's worth
exactly.
holding feet to the fire. It's like, no, just make a decision. We won't hold you
Yeah,
to it.
make any
Make a
decision,
decision.
and let's worry about if it's a bad decision, then let's fix it, but make a decision. Don't delay the
Exactly.
process. Exactly. Okay, so we are in agreement here. Okay, so now maybe I'll pick your brain a bit, about sharing some, personal stories. Of course, without sharing any names or anything like that, where a tabletop completely changed how the executive team saw cyber risk, or unlocked the support for a key initiative.
Yeah.
And then what happened, and what shifted as a result?
Yeah.
If you
So
could maybe
there's
think
one I
of one.
ran. So go ahead.
Yeah, if you can think of one example, something interesting.
Yeah, there's
Well.
there's one I ran with a colleague of mine a year or two ago, and it has stuck with me ever since. The scenario
Mm-hmm.
was relatively straightforward. Their new HR system they were rolling out had a breach, and all the data got leaked. The
Mm-hmm.
data that was leaked included HR files on specific employees, including planned write ups, planned terminations. And so in the data dump in the scenario, there was all this sensitive information, right? PII, all these things. And so we started off the scenario focused on just the classic cyber breach. How do we handle this? But that scenario escalated into an active shooter incident because this company had regional offices and one of the employees at that office read the breach data that was published online and saw these really bad write ups and these notes in there that management is working to terminate them. And so in this scenario, this disgruntled employee became an active shooter threat to this location. And so as
Oh.
we went through this, there was a couple things that were really interesting. The first was the game really changed when the exercise went from this abstract data loss scenario, like, hey, our data's out there, it's not great, it's a PR disaster, but it became something much more tangible, which is the loss of human lives, which is the impact to the emotions and the psyche of those teams impacted. And so that was the first one. Adding a physical component, and it doesn't have to be an active shooter, but it could be a factory downtime, or it could be a building has to be evacuated in a scenario, really can level up the how connected a team feels to the scenario, how realistic it feels, right? It can be hard sometimes to envision the damage from how much does it really hurt if all of our employee performance reviews are leaked. It's not great, it doesn't look good, but it's a PR disaster, I think is how a lot of people see it. But it can be so much worse than that. I mean, there's employees who might quit, there's all that. And so if you can find a way to tangibly tie that cyber breach back to a much more understandable pain point, a less abstract pain point for those executives, it goes great. So that was one of the first big ones. The other
Okay.
one we learned was the tabletop had gone on for maybe 40 minutes discussing how do we handle the response to the active shooter and all of this. And in the scenario timeline, as we'd have tell us how much things would take, we'd moved forward about a day in the scenario. So it's now 24 hours after the active shooter incident. And leadership had taken no steps in any of the conversation that happened to restore operations, to focus on getting back up, getting that facility open, getting manufacturing going. And so it put me in the very unfortunate position to go, well, are we concerned about recovery? Who's focusing on the recovery? Who's leading getting the business back
Yeah.
up and running? Or does that even matter right now?
Hmm.
I told him, I was like, you could tell me right now, we don't care. We're only focusing on making sure our injured employees are taken care of, that everybody's getting therapy, that we're doing things to take care of our teams. Um, and that's okay. But that's all they want to talk about. And I loved it because it's this large corporation that outside out, you might think they don't care about the employees, but they wouldn't stop talking about all the little things they want to do for the employees. But it highlighted that sometimes the real world response needs to take the impacted teams off the board. You have to take them out of the
Oh.
recovery operations. And so one of the decisions that came out of lessons learned was they were setting up executive parachute teams from other locations. So if a location suffers some sort of debilitating event, but the facility is recoverable, that it's not the local executive team that's having to see that. They get to take care of their teams, they get to focus on rebuilding everybody's mental state and physical well-being, and a new executive team swaps in to take care of the business side of things. And there's some industries where that's fairly common, but it was really interesting to see a cyber scenario evolve like that. And it really changed how these executives were thinking about the cyber incidents, right? It went from this abstract, oh, it's data loss, to, oh, this data loss could impact employees' quality of life, could impact their physical health and safety. And so that's an extreme example, but it really
Mm-hmm.
did change how these folks thought about it. So much so that they wanted another tabletop 6 months later for a different scenario of their choosing, but to continue those conversations, to uncover similar pain points. And they have continued to do regular tabletops since then on all sorts of scenarios, from technical to executive. And executives are now asking to see the reports from the technical tabletops. They're asking to see readouts or to have a meeting with the system. It's like, hey, so what did we learn? Which is a complete game changer. But a lot of that came from one, the CISO really championing resiliency and recovery, but two, that tabletop that allowed him to highlight the very tangible impacts of sometimes this very abstract concept of data loss.
Yeah. So I mean, these are all strong examples, and they all, kind of come into one conclusion, you know, lesson learned at the end, right?
Yes.
So,
Yeah.
this is the most valuable, resource that you can have at the end.
Yeah. Yeah.
Okay,
If you don't do
so
those lessons learned, I mean, you wasted all everybody's time, all the prep time, all of that. So if you don't make the lessons learned really the star of the show, frankly,
mhm,
it may be a question of why should we do this?
exactly. So now the next question is, on the opposite side, on the flip of the coin. Can you think of one table top that just didn't work out at all? And if you can just tell us like what went wrong and what did and what did you learn from it exactly? So it's coming back to that to how we concluded the other question.
Yeah.
Or did a lesson learned from that?
So I talked a little bit earlier about the tabletop where the executive stopped the tabletops 30, 40 minutes into the tabletop and just called it
Hmm.
quits. I mean, that was
Hmm.
probably the worst tabletop experience I've ever had. It's unpleasant, it's difficult to process, but it highlighted some real tangible things. And I know I talked about it a bit before. One of the big ones that we've belabored through this call quite nicely is getting that buy-in ahead of the meeting. Not necessarily buy-in on the scenario, getting their buy-in on security, but getting their buy-in to want to be there, to make sure they understand that the things they care about will be reflected in one way or another in a tabletop. Um,
Okay.
so the takeaway from that was really like I let the client team run a very siloed tabletop, but with broader impacts, broader stakeholders involved. And so
Mm,
both myself and the client next year, when it came time to do our tabletop, we spent a lot of time sitting down with leadership and one-on-one in group settings, understanding what are they
yeah.
looking for, learning from the pain points, but also understanding like, hey, look, we thought ransomware was a point that had been beaten to death in this organization. But the recurring theme from the leadership is like, we don't know how we'd handle a ransomware incident. So we're like, okay, we were going to do something else, going to do something maybe more tailored or whatever you want to phrase that. But listen to your stakeholders. If they're still year after year concerned about the same thing, one, maybe you need to do a tabletop, but two, maybe you need to take a really intentional focus on what are those missing pieces? What do they not understand? And make sure the scenario and the walkthroughs highlight that. So you can actually close some of those knowledge gaps, close some of those confidence gaps, and really empower that team so that next year they can go, I'm less worried about ransomware. We really crushed ransomware last year. I feel really good that we can put our processes in motion and highlight some new concerns or areas of interest.
Hmm. Yeah. So I see another benefit here. As a lesson learned, pretty much, feedback from the stakeholders, which is also fundamental for
Yep.
your future, all the next steps that you will take. All right, cool, very good. Um, now when we talk about, when the tabletop, kind of shows the clear gaps, missing processes or unclear roles, tech debt, and etc. How do you turn those insights into concrete support for a security roadmap or like a budget request, for example?
Yeah. So I'll go back to lessons learned because this is where
Okay.
it's going to be a lot hard to do this in 3 weeks once they've got the final report in hand.
Mhm.
Doing some of this in lessons learned is going to be critical because if one of the lessons learned is, hey, we have this technical vulnerability due to how we've designed some of our infrastructure and how we can monitor and secure some of our infrastructure, that's a lesson learned. The facilitator and the CISO or the security leader really need to make sure that we're not just saying, okay, great, that's a risk to put on our resources, but like, okay, have your security leader talk about, hey, this is tools I have explored. It's going to cost us about $60,000 a year to implement this and to maintain it year over year. Give them a chance to highlight that. Make sure that they can talk actual financials in that moment. There may be a time where they can't. You go, hey, I've not looked into this. I don't know how much this is going to cost. But at least prep that, hey, there's a budget ask coming. If you say you care about this and it sounds like you do, then I'm going to work on this and try and get a budget proposal in front of you or an RFP in the next couple of weeks. Um, so kind of using that lessons learned to empower the people that need to make those asks to at least pitch those asks in that conversation. Like, hey, I could solve this with a tool. And sometimes it's not a tool. Sometimes it's like, look, I need better pipelines of communication with the infrastructure team or an operational team because I need that to go. And going ahead and going like, okay, who do I talk to? Who do I make that to? Because then that executive that needs to make that plan a reality can leave that meeting with a name, a person, a subject, and the folks in that room buying like, yeah, we should have that conversation. So if I was that executive, I can roll into this conversation like, hey, Daniel, I'm super glad to connect. And I can quickly read you in on kind of what we learned from the tabletop, that management really cares about this, and start to do some of that relationship building with you so that we can improve whatever process or pipeline we need. So that lessons learned is where a lot of this needs to happen, even if it's just high level to get intent down. Because if we all just go, yep, these are the lessons learned, great, and we don't start attaching action or vision or motivation to them in that thing, I can give you the best report in the world 3 weeks later, 2 weeks later, however long. And it's just going to be one more thing to read, one more thing the CISO has now his checklist of things to put on his risk register, to put on the security roadmap, but it's disconnected. If I can use some of this time, and the CISO and the security team can use some of this time on this call to start framing this, to start making very clear asks or specific asks, you're going to be so much better off translating this to budget. And I have seen tabletops where, I think I mentioned in the beginning, the CFO goes, oh, it's within my sign-off authority to issue that. You've got my verbal sign-off. Send me something in the next day or two, and I'll follow a process to sign off on it. But you can also walk out with verbal yeses on key decisions, on personnel, on financials. So use that time wisely, and you might find it works quite well.
Yeah, I mean, as we said, no decision is bad.
Yep.
For me, it almost like turns the top table into a like a almost like a live business case. So for
Yep.
example, instead of asking for a budget in the abstract, so to speak, it could be pointing back to situations where executives have just lived through in the room, pretty much. So
Yeah.
so
The
that's
the one thing to keep in mind to my previous comment is, yes, try and get some action out of that meeting, but there may be some things that people need to sit with, to your point, right? They've just lived through something
exactly.
that might be slightly scary, might be traumatizing, might have been
Yeah.
difficult for a lot of reasons. Hold them too fast and too hard to a decision, or to make a decision, might not be reasonable or fair either. So in those scenarios, when it's very clear that, hey, this has been hard, tell them, hey, can we meet again in 2 days for 30 minutes to do an additional lessons learned that is kind of capturing path forward kind of vision. It's close enough in time nobody's forgotten, and you can get people into that second meeting, but you don't go, great, you're scared, you're frustrated, you're whatever emotion you're feeling, and now I'm going to shake you till you give me an answer. Watch how people are responding to tabletop, so that you can kind of determine, do we need to talk about this a little later to actually capture motivations? But don't
I
go, we'll
mean,
talk about this later, and then don't schedule time or something. Take advantage, schedule some time, doesn't have to be a lot, to revisit some of this so that it doesn't drop off schedules and agendas.
all right. So yeah, fantastic. I mean, spot on again. So Philip, let's talk about frequency and maturity. So how often should organizations run those executive level tabletops? So if they want to build real maturity and keep leaders engaged, not bored,
Yeah, philosophies
what's
on this vary.
is there any pattern here?
Yeah, philosophies really vary here. And so I'll give my 2 cents.
Okay.
And
Yeah,
I'm sure people might have a different stance as well.
of course.
But for the executive tabletops, really tailored to the executive audience, I'd say at least once a year. And right
Okay.
between the educational component and some of those key things you want to highlight based on the evolving threat landscape, I think if you do it less than once a year, you're starting to run into issues. On the
Okay.
flip side, I wouldn't recommend doing them quarterly, because it's eventually become a check the box exercise for them, and they're gonna not see it as valuable.
Yeah, you're
I've
not
seen
learning it. There's a, the learning curve is, I mean, it's a too short of a period to
yeah.
make
So
significant
I think
change.
some orgs do every 6 months, but again, those orgs that tend to do it more frequently tend to have more
Mhm.
maturity, tend to have more executive buy-in, and those tabletops tend to be shorter because people know
Sure.
their roles, tend to move quickly, And it is, again, back to it's a way of educating about the evolving threat landscape and new decisions that they need from management to add to their playbooks. But that's a sign of a very mature organization. I think most organizations, especially if their security program is on the younger side or if their executive buy-in is still not fully mature, once a year, coupled with some of those other activities, is your best bet. And then add to it. You may have a tabletop where leadership goes, well, we didn't touch this a whole lot, but in 6 months, could we revisit this one specific scenario component? Great, do that for an hour and a half or less to revisit something very specific, get them what they're asking for. But again, you're not squishing them. That doesn't mean you can't do technical tabletops or mixed tabletops, hybrid tabletops in addition to the executive. But I think for most organizations, start with a year and then see how you go year two, see if that was enough time, too little time, too much time. I think you might find us too much time because your leadership team wants more investment in this. Many orgs, I think you'll be hard pressed to hit quarterly without really starting to treat it as just a procedural item rather than a true buy-in and engagement oriented exercise.
Okay. And I think that the next topic is very important because that's where you have different departments, different types of people with different roles and experiences, communicating. So the tabletops often bring, as I said, for example, legal, communications, operations, IT, security, others like finance, whatever. And in that instance, what changes have you seen in cross functional communications and role clarity after a few of these sessions that you had? So if you
Yeah.
had different people in the room, so to
I
speak.
think the first one you often see is informal cross-functional communication. You might see two
Okay.
executives using the chat going, hey, Jennifer, you and I, we need to connect and we need to talk about some of this afterwards, right? You start to see some
Yeah,
informal communication channels developing. And I know formality is great, but I think it's a great sign when the chat has these like, hey, Jennifer, you and I need to meet. And somebody else is going like, Bob, you and I need to meet and talk about this. Like,
Mhm.
if all I get is informal communication channels out of that, we're already off to a great start because it moves it out of a security domain to foster those communications, but actually puts it into two teams that need to talk. And security might be involved, might not, but talk through it. I think more maturity wise, playbooks and run books that emphasize communication that specifically call out when you hit this point, you need to talk to comms and comms needs to talk to legal. And you can get really specific with kind of the response activities that need to happen. And there's nothing wrong with that. But those only work if those people are actually willing to call each other on a good day and
Yeah.
have established communication methods. So I think look for those informal ones. If those aren't coming out of there, as a security leader, you need to start working like, hey, how do I get those going after this tabletop so that when we do have their detailed mature run books with the 10 steps that need to happen communication wise, those channels are there, those relationships are there. And sometimes it is unfortunately going to be on the CISO or security leader to
Mhm.
foster those relationships between those teams that may not actually need the security leader involved.
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. I mean, when you said that, informal, I was like, yeah, it totally resonates with what I have experienced in my business career. I mean, formalities are good, but if they're not backed by your personal, so to speak, human contacts, nothing is gonna actually work out. So yeah,
100%.
I'm with you. I'm with you 100% on that as well. And Philip, how do you choose or tailor scenarios so they rely really resonate with a specific business? For example, what I mean, like a ransomware versus a data breach versus OT disruption, or third party outage, for example.
I think a lot of this goes back to that anatomy component, which is figuring
Oh.
out what is the basis, and that results in understanding the threat landscape. If you, as the person designing a tabletop, understand the threat landscape for that business, for that industry, you'll
Uh-huh.
see some good scenarios shake out fairly quickly. You'll see kind of the business model of the attackers that are commonly executing these attacks in your industry, and that changes it, right? Because I'm dealing with a nation state threat actor that their goal is to get in your systems, filtrate data, watch, listen, learn. That's going to look very different than a financially motivated attacker executing the same attack pipeline, kill chain, whatever you want to call it, who wants to get that data quickly so that they can ransom you. And so their approaches may vary even with the same kill chain. So understand the threat landscape to your business. And you'll probably have, as a result of that exercise, 3 or 4 kind of branded, kind of thematic scenarios that come out: ransomware, supply chain failures, things like that. And then look at that in the context of, like, what did your leadership tell you they care about? What are the objectives you've set? And that lets you kind of refine that list down and go from there. I think the risk is you go too vague. Right? Oh, we're going to do ransomware, and it doesn't really show how it happened for this organization and how it impacts the business. So you're not talking specific systems that are impacted, or you don't have that level of tailorization. But on the flip side, you can go too specific. I can specify server instances that were compromised and all these things. But then again, I've got my audience glazing over because the scenario's at a level that doesn't matter to decisions that the stakeholders in that room need to make.
Okay, that's very clear to me. And like when you actually up, faced with CEO, and he asks you, how do we know this tabletop was successful? What do you point to beyond a checklist or attendance list to him?
Yeah, I like to point to that lessons learned. Again, kind of we're talking about this a lot, but I like pointed lessons learned. And that doesn't mean I'm showing, here's the list of findings. Every single one of these findings is fantastic. I don't need to fix them all. But I talk about how much discussion there was, how every single person in the room had a lessons learned they brought to the table. And every single person there walked away with something they want to work on with their teams or with another team. That's a success. When I can build that momentum, that engagement, right, we talked about, that is, for the CEO, that measure of success that I would highlight, which is people are talking, people are excited, people are learning. Then it doesn't matter if I've got 10 lessons learned or 30. I can show these lessons learned came as a result of good conversation, discussion, and actual engagement from your leadership team. Um, so again, it doesn't matter if I've got like 15 highs, right? If I'm presenting a CEO a list of findings and I'm presenting them all, I've missed the mark. But if I can show them, like, look, your team was prolific. They talked for 40 minutes about the lessons learned. There's multiple calls scheduled after to start working on some of these. And on top of that, the report includes 30 things that the folks in the room were bought in on.
Right.
That is my metric for success. And if I can't
Yeah.
effectively communicate that to the senior executive, then I need to go back to, okay, what was missed? What do we learn from here? Because it may be something just I didn't have the visibility, but it may also be, hey, we did miss the mark, because all I can show him is numbers on a page and a number of
Yeah.
findings that we need to fix.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly. Like, I mean, success isn't the session that happened, isn't that the session happened. I mean, to me, like in this case would be success is that decisions, priorities, or behaviors look different afterwards. That would
Yeah.
be like the
Yeah, there are tabletops where there's pass or fail, right? Because we have
Mhm.
recovery times and recovery objectives, and we met those. So there are sometimes you can have a pass metric. But again, that might just show the executive. It's a footnote. I might include it with the executive. Like, hey, look, we met all of our recovery objectives. Like, the team really performed at a high level. But at
Mhm.
the same time, it's a binary decision. You either pass or fail for a lot of times.
Yeah.
But it doesn't show the executive that engagement and that buy-in was reached.
Correct. Okay, and now, Philip, two quick perspectives just to close our podcast today. First, what's your advice to executives who join these sessions so they get maximum value out of it? And second, your maybe top 1, 2 tips for security leaders planning their first executive level tabletop.
Yeah, broad advice to execs and security leaders. I mean, the first one is do them.
Yeah.
It may seem silly, but a lot of companies are still doing technical or security team exercises, and they're not doing executive focused tabletops. Make sure you're doing
Ah,
executive focused tabletops. Make sure you're designing those tabletops for them. When it comes to, like, the nitty gritty, when it comes to those tabletops, I'd say don't run before you can walk. It can be very tempting to walk into that first executive tabletop with this massive barrier scenario, all these challenges, multiple injects, and it's great. But it's like, it misses the mark because those executives, it may be the first time in their entire career they're being asked to think about scenarios like this. It may be the first time they're looking at this specific threat actor type and these decisions. So if you go too hard out of the gate, you might miss the mark because everybody's kind of stuck and is kind of set up for failure. So right size your first couple of these. Make sure you're not trying to get too much out of it. And again, that goes back to those
Mm.
objectives. Make sure those objectives are reasonable. And then from there, build a scenario that is right sized to maturity. Uh, the other thing is, again, we talked about right people in the room. Make sure you have the right people in the room to meet those objectives. In some orgs,
Mhm.
that might look like a bunch of SVPs first time around and not C suite and ELT. In some, it might look like a mix. And in some, it might look like, hey, we've got technical folks in the room, but they have been prepped to give summary answers instead of deep dives into the tech stack. So those would be the points of advice I give, but I really think it boils down to do it. It doesn't matter if you fail, quote unquote. It doesn't matter if it's not perfect, but just make sure you're doing it and make sure you're focusing on learning from it. Because if everybody's going to wanting to learn and wanting to make sure this is happening, you're going to come out better than when you went in.
Mm. What a great way to summarize it, Philip. And just for me, kind of like, wrapping up and trying to, connect the dots from what you told us today. So for example, if executives show up with total like curiosity, and all these like security leaders just show up with very clear, very simple design, the tabletops can become one of the most strategic tools in the whole, security program. And I
100%.
think also a good way to summarize it. Okay, so I would say, Philip, thanks so much, for joining me today and for walking us through how to use tabletops exercises and as a real lever for, the executive buy-in,
Yep.
so to speak. So we covered a lot today, from common misconceptions at the leadership level, to what makes a tabletop really land with executives, to how you turn those insights into concrete decisions, budgets, and stronger security posture at the end. So and for everyone listening, thank you for tuning in to Secure by Design podcast. And if you found this episode useful, please follow or subscribe to the podcast, share it with a colleague, and leave us a rating or review. It really helps more people discover these conversations. We'll be back next month with our next episode, diving into another practical angle on building security into the way your organization works. So until then, stay safe and stay secure by design. Again, Philip, thank you so much and so long.
Thank you.